I never planned to spend the whole winter alone on the ridge. It just happened that way. By the time the heavy snows arrived, the mountain road leading to my cabin had narrowed into a frozen, white tunnel. The kind you enter slowly, grip the wheel a little tighter for, and hope you come out the other side, still feeling like yourself. I'd grown used to that feeling over the last few years, the sense that I was passing through something, changing in quiet ways I wouldn't recognize until much later. The cabin had settled into its winter posture too. Wood creaked differently in the cold. The windows rattled when the wind picked up. Even the lake out front seemed to hold its breath under layers of ice. You learn to read winter differently in the mountains, not as an obstacle, but as a teacher. A patient one, a stern one, a quiet one. This episode in my life really began with a storm. It was early morning, still dark, when I woke to the sound of wind slamming against the shutters. At first, I thought it was some dream working its way into reality, some echo of a memory. But then I felt the cold seeping through the walls, sharper than usual, and I knew something was wrong. I lit the lantern by the bedside and glanced at the tiny thermometer nailed to the wooden beam. The needle hovered lower than I had ever seen it. The fire had gone out during the night. That only happened if the wind pushed the draft so violently that the smoke suffocated the flames. It's strange, the things you learn to fear in a place like this. Not the big dramatic things, bears, cliffs, avalanches. It's the small failures that make your pulse quicken. A blown fuse, a cracked pipe, a fire that dies when you need it most. I got up, pulled on a sweater, and padded quietly into the main room. The air bit at my face. My breath hung in a faint cloud, drifting toward the ceiling. I knelt by the fireplace, cleared the half-burned logs, and built a new stack by instinct. The first spark didn't catch. The second didn't either. On the fourth try, a thin thread of flame curled upward, hesitated, and then finally took hold. I exhaled in relief. Sometimes the smallest victories keep a man going. As I warmed my hands, I thought about the last time I'd felt this particular mix of cold and uncertainty. It was years ago in college when Ethan and I were driving back to campus after winter break. We hit an unexpected snowstorm, the kind that makes the world dissolve into white. The wind rocked the little car like it weighed nothing. Ethan laughed nervously, pretending he wasn't scared. I stared straight ahead, trying not to think about the fact that everything outside the windshield looked the same. Sky, ground, road, all erased. Funny how the mind stores moments like that. Not special occasions, not celebrations, but the quiet turning points when you realize something about yourself. Back then, I learned that I wasn't afraid of storms. I was afraid of not knowing where they would leave me. This storm felt like that. By midday, the wind had shaped the snow into drifts taller than my waist. The ridge disappeared. The lake became a single sheet of white glass. I spent hours reinforcing the shutters and checking the food stores. The air pressure dropped so low I felt it in my chest. And then, right around dusk, I heard a noise I'd never heard in the mountains before. A distant hum. Mechanical. Faint but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was just the storm playing tricks on me. Howling wind can mimic almost anything if you listen long enough. But the sound grew louder, steadier. Closer. I stepped outside, bracing against the wind. Snowflakes slapped my face sideways. I could barely see more than 20 feet ahead. But through the swirling white, something moved. Headlights. A vehicle strained its way up the road, tires biting into the ice. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared back to life. Whoever was driving was pushing the machine hard. I tightened my jacket and walked toward the edge of the property. The headlights wobbled, dipped, swerved, and then stopped completely. The door opened. A figure stepped out, hunched against the wind. For a second, I froze. Visitors were rare enough in summer. In a blizzard? Almost unheard of. The figure waved an arm. "Hey, anyone here?" The voice was muffled, but clear enough. I raised my hand. Here, come this way. They stumbled forward, boots sinking into the snow. When they reached the porch light, I finally saw their face, a young man, maybe mid-20s, with snow plastered into his hair and panic in his eyes. "You Tim?" he asked, panting. I nodded slowly. "Yeah. What's going on?" He swallowed hard. "My uncle. He fell. Up on the North Ridge. He can't move his leg. I tried calling for help, but there's no service. The road's blocked. You're the only cabin close enough." His breath caught. He wasn't lying. He wasn't exaggerating. He was scared in a deep, human way, the kind that shows in the eyes before the voice. "All right," I said, already reaching for my boots. "Let's go." If you've never hiked in a storm at night, you can't really understand the strange mix of focus and fear that takes over. The world shrinks into a tunnel of noise and movement. You don't think about the cold. You don't think about the dark. You think about the next step, and the next, and the next. The young man's name was Lucas. He walked fast, faster than I expected someone in a panic to walk. But fear fuels people differently. I followed his footprints, watching the snow refill them seconds after he lifted his boots. "Where's your uncle exactly?" I shouted over the wind. "Near Eagle Spine," he yelled back. We were tracking elk when he slipped. Eagle Spine, a narrow ridge with sheer drops on both sides. One wrong step and you fall 50 feet. "Why were you out there today?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Then, voice shaking, he said he wanted to prove he could still do it. He's stubborn. Always has been. I didn't respond. I knew the type. Strong-willed. Proud. The kind who'd rather break a bone than ask for help. The wind howled so loudly it felt like the mountain was speaking. Snow whipped around us, thick and relentless. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. "How far?" I called out. "Close." Lucas pointed ahead. "He's just past that outcrop." I could barely see the outline of the rocks. We climbed, slipping on hidden patches of ice. And then I heard it. A faint groan. A human one. We rounded the outcrop and saw him. A middle-aged man, half buried in snow, leaning against a boulder. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. Relief washed over his face when he saw us. "About damn time," he muttered, trying and failing to sound tough. "You landed in the worst possible place," I said, crouching beside him. "But you're lucky. It could have been worse." He grunted. "Not sure about lucky." I checked his pulse, his breathing, both strong. He definitely couldn't walk, but he was stable enough to move with support. "This is going to hurt," I warned. "But we have to get you up." He nodded reluctantly. Lucas took one side, I took the other. We lifted him slowly. He grimaced, biting back a cry. The wind grew even fiercer. "We need shelter," I said. "There's an old ranger hut halfway down the trail. We won't make it back to the cabin before the storm gets worse." Lucas nodded. His uncle didn't argue. That's how I knew the pain was serious. It took us nearly an hour to reach the hut, though in my memory it feels like a blur, a single long stretch of effort and concentration. The hut was barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it broke the wind. I set the injured man against the far wall, covered him with my jacket, and started a small fire in the rusted stove. Heat takes time to return to cold fingers. When it finally does, it hurts before it comforts. Lucas sat by the stove, rubbing his arms. His face was pale from the cold and fear. "You did the right thing coming to my cabin," I told him. He looked up, guilt flickering in his eyes. I should have stopped him. He's been trying to prove he can still do what he did when he was younger. I knew the weather was turning, but he trailed off. It reminded me painfully of something from my own past, of a moment when I hadn't stopped someone I cared about from making a mistake. A moment when I stayed quiet instead of stepping in. One I still carried. "Everyone wants to feel capable," I said quietly. "Sometimes we don't see our limits until life forces them into view." Lucas nodded, staring at the fire. His uncle shifted uncomfortably, groaning under his breath. I can hear you too, you know. I almost smiled. We stayed there until dawn. The storm raged all night, rattling the walls like a living thing. The wind screamed down the chimney. Snow forced its way in through tiny cracks in the wood. But the three of us kept the fire alive, feeding it small pieces of wood whenever the flames began to thin. When morning came, the world outside looked transformed. The storm had buried half the hut. The sky, however, was clear, a pale blue hemisphere stretched above endless white. Lucas helped me fashion a makeshift sled out of 2 planks and rope. We secured his uncle as gently as we could and began the slow descent back to the cabin. The landscape was almost unrecognizable. Trees bowed under the weight of snow. Rocks disappeared entirely. Tracks vanished seconds after we made them. Yet somehow, the silence felt peaceful, calmer than the day before, almost forgiving. When we reached the cabin, I radioed the local search and rescue team. They arrived within the hour, transported Lucas and his uncle to the clinic in town, and thanked me more times than I deserved. Before he left, Lucas said, "If you hadn't been there, I don't know what would have happened." I just shook my head. "You were brave. You came for help. That's what matters." He hesitated. "I don't know how to repay you." "You already did," I told him. "You reminded me why I live out here, why I stay." People think solitude means no responsibility, but it doesn't. It means you have to show up when you're needed. He gave a small, grateful smile. Then they were gone. The cabin felt emptier than usual that evening. Not in a lonely way, more in a reflective one. Winter has a way of exposing the inner landscape the same way it reveals the contours of the mountain. Clearly, honestly, without distraction. As I sat by the fire, listening to the crackle of wood, I felt something shift in me. Something small but real. The kind of shift that happens quietly, like snow sliding down a roof. I realized that helping Lucas and his uncle hadn't just been about stepping in during an emergency. It had reminded me of something I'd buried, the part of myself that still believed I could be useful to others, that I could be steady when needed, that I could choose connection, even if only in moments. I thought of Ethan, of Anna, of the life I'd left behind, of the man I was still learning to become. The ridge outside the cabin glowed gold in the late afternoon sun. Birds flitted across the lake, leaving delicate marks on the snow. For the first time in a long time, the world felt aligned. Not easy, not simple, but aligned. The storm had passed, and so I realized quietly, had I?